Unit 22, Conceptualizing Ethnicity. Contents: 22.1 Introduction, 22.2 Class and Ethnicity, 22.3 Construction of Ethnicity, 22.4 Primordialist Approach, 22.5 Instrumentalist Approach, 22.6 Constructivist Model of Ethnicity, 22.7 Jenkin's Model of Ethnicity, 22.8 Race and Ethnicity, 22.9 Conclusion, 22.10 References. Learning objectives. After studying this unit, you will be able to describe class and ethnicity, indicate the construction of ethnicity, outline the primordialist, instrumentalist, and constructivist models of ethnicity, explain the relationship between race and ethnicity. 22.1 Introduction. Being different is a construct that we have all somehow somewhere internalized. We learn to be different as we are constantly told in the initial stages of our primary socialization that it is natural to be segregated. Constant reckoning that boys are boys and girls are girls instill an element of gender segregation and awareness of self in terms of notions of us versus them. As one moves through various life cycle processes, construction of categories of us in contrast to them acquires different contours. Cultural contents are added to these reconstructions of us versus them. These reconstructions also often acquire prejudices and voluntary affirmation of stereotypes. It is recognition of these repetitive behavioral patterns and emergent consequences that is instrumental in sociological conceptualization of notions of ethnicity. Ethnicity is derived from the ancient Greek word ethnos, which refers to a range of situations where there is a sense of collectivity of humans that live and act together. The notion is often translated today as people or nation. Its use in contemporary sociology and in popular conception is relatively recent. The term was popularized in common American usage with the publication of Yankee City series published in 1941, The Social Life of a Modern City, and The Status System of a Modern Community, two important books written by W. Lloyd Warner and Paul S. Lowe that brought into focus various paradoxes and ambiguities inherent in the concept. One was looking for a noun to parallel the categories of age, sex, religion, and class. When he came across the Greek noun ethnos, used to refer to nation, peoples, and others, Warner used the term ethnicity as a trait that separates the individuals from some classes and identifies them with the others. Located in the context of America and numerous studies that followed search of American identity in the post-World War II America, ethnicity became a search for American identity versus minority identities or immigrant identities. Demonstrating this trend, Philip Gleason wrote in his essay entitled Americans All: Ethnicity, Ideology, and American Identity in the Era of World War II in the Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups. As part of the broader American studies movement that grew up in the post-war years, ethnic was conceptualized as a prototypically American figure, not because of any distinctiveness of cultural heritage, but for exactly the opposite reason, because ethnic exhibited in an extreme degree the character structure produced by the American experience of change, mobility, and loss of contact with the past. A statement that was beautifully chronicled years before the Gleason's analysis came to the fore by Oscar Handlin in 1951 in the introduction to his fascinating work, The Uprooted, whereby he wrote that once I thought to write a history of the immigrants in America, then I discovered that the immigrants were American history. Whatever may be the limitations of the numerous studies on ethnicity, one common denominator that stands out is that ethnicity studies are conducted in relation to others and focus on the external, involuntary projective and internal voluntary subjective. Ethnicity in sociological literature is often constructed in relation to the concept like class and modernity. 22.2 Class and Ethnicity. The concept of class, rooted in Marxian dictum of hierarchies and percepts of social stratification, also encompasses within its scope notions of class consciousness, an idea that talks about building in group solidarity. Ethnicity as a social construct has also evolved on perceptions of bonding and collectivity. Class theory is used exploitation by the others as an instrument for strengthening class solidarity. In a similar vein, those subscribing to constructs of ethnicity focus upon common experiences to develop a sense of ethnic consciousness. Irrespective of these common features, many in sociological and social sciences could argue that ethnicity is not class. However, at the same time, none of them would deny the crucial relationship that ethnicity has with class. Daniel Bell, 1975, in his acclaimed essay on ethnicity and social change, argues the reduction of class sentiments is one of the factors one associated with the rise of ethnic identification. He further submits that ethnicity has become more salient because it can combine interest with an effective tie. Ethnicity provides a tangible set of common identities in language, food, music, names, when other social roles become more abstract and impersonal. Glaser and Moynihan, authors of one of the most popular writings on the subject titled Beyond the Melting Pot, express similar sentiments. They write in their 1975 publication of Ethnicity, Theory and Experience. As against the class-based forms of social identification and conflict, which of course continue to exist, we have been surprised by the persistence and salience of ethnic-based forms of social identification and conflict. In a perspective statement elsewhere, Atlantic Monthly, August 1968, they argue our contemporary preoccupation with issues such as capitalism, socialism and communism keeps us from seeing that the turbulence of these times has had far more to do with ethnic, racial and religious affiliation than with these other issues. The term ethnicity acquired enormous political implications, in particular after the disintegration of elsewhere nation states like former Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and even that followed by the bombing of World Trade Center in New York on 9/11. The term came in frequent use in anthropological and sociological writing only in early 70s. It is interesting to note that prior to 1970s, textbooks in anthropology and sociology hardly ever identified ethnicity. There are some references to ethnic groups in the literature pertaining to early decades of 20th century. Box 22.1 Rethinking Ethnicity. Richard Jenkins, in his critically acclaimed work titled Rethinking Ethnicity, Arguments and Explorations, notes, since the early decades of this century, the linked concepts of ethnicity and ethnic group have been taken in many directions, academically and otherwise. They have passed into everyday's discourse and become central to the political group differentiation and advent in the culturally diverse social democracies of Europe and North America. With the notions of race in the public and scientific disrepute since 1945, ethnicity has obligingly stepped into the gap, becoming a rallying cry in the bloody, often reorganization of the post-Cold War world. The obscenity of ethnic cleansing stands shoulder to shoulder with earlier euphemisms such as racial hygiene and the final solution. Two things emerge in Jenkin's interesting interceptions of ethnicity. First suggests that the notions of ethnicity and the ethnic groups travel together. If ethnicity emerged a key sociological and political concept only in the early 70s, it was in operation as a sociological reality much before that and was commonly addressed in solidarities and differences that marked social and cultural groups. The second point that is highlighted in the expert is that the nomenclature of ethnic group appeared as a natural and neutral options to the much beleaguered and abused notion of race. Jenkins also refers to advantages that accrue because of ethnic affiliation. Sometimes these advantages are granted to groups because they are perceived to the marginal to the other groups in the societies. You are probably familiar with the notion of protective discrimination or reservations, which is addressed as affirmative action in favor of racially underprivileged groups in North America. It is important to understand that here that being part of an ethnic group provides a sense of belonging and an assertion of identity. This sense of belonging and identity also accompany certain advantages and disadvantages. We will discuss some of these issues in the following lessons on construction of identity and boundary maintenance. In this lesson, we will essentially focus on conceptualizing ethnicity, its historical roots, and various theories propounded by various scholars for its substances. Construction 22.3 Construction of Ethnicity. Some contributors to the theory of ethnicity trace back its origins to the early works of Max Weber. Weber, in one of his important contributions, namely Economy and Society, first published in 1922 and reprinted in 1968, regards as an ethnic group to be a group whose members share a belief that they have a common ancestor, or to put it differently, they are of common descent. He qualifies his statement by suggesting that ethnic membership does not constitute a group. It is only facilitate group formations of any kind, particularly in the political sphere. On the other hand, it is primarily the political community, no matter how artificially organized, that inspires the belief in common ethnicity. It is apparent from the Weber's statement that biology had little more to play in cultivating sense of belonging. Weber perceived ethnic group as a status group. Status groups may be rooted in perceptions of a shared religion, language, or culture. Members of the groups on the basis of shared community tend to form monopolistic social closure. That is, they refuse to let others enter their exclusive domain. Every member of the groups knows that what is expected of him in a situations of collective participation. They also functions together to protect each other's honor and dignity. It is on these perceptions that suicide squads operate in political struggles. Weber also argues that since the possibilities for collective action rooted in ethnicity are indefinite, the ethnic group and its close relative nation cannot easily be precisely defined for sociological purposes. This profound statement by Weber enables us to understand how political acts of subversion under one regime are celebrated as a heroic and patriotic by those who are seeking political sovereignty, and are condemned as acts of treason by those governing the nation state. You must be reading articles in newspapers about ongoing struggle between Israel and Palestine and various other so-called insurgent groups and the nation states. Ethnicity form complex equations, and simple cultural or ethnological explanations are not enough to unfold its mysteries. Ethnicity as a theoretical tool for understanding complex questions of social interactions and political information holds equal interest not only for sociologists but also for anthropologists and political scientists. In a broad sense, three approaches to the understanding of ethnicity can be considered, namely Primordialist, Instrumentalist, and Constructivist. 22.4 Primordialist Approach. Primordialist approach recognizes biology as the fundamentals of establishing ethnic identity. The biological roots are determined by genetic and geographical factors. These links result in the formation of close-knit kin groups. Kin group loyalties demand that near relatives are favored by those in situations of command and controlling resources. In contemporary terminology, such favors are rebuked for being nepotistic. Nepotism is defined as the tendency to favor kin over non-kin. This principle of kin selection based on conception of sociobiology is not acceptable in societies that claim to be a democratic and follow principles of meritocracy. Prairie Van D. Vergey explains that, in general, ethnicity is defined as a comprehensive form of natural selection and kinship connections, a primordial instinctive impulse, which continues to be present even in the most industrialized mass societies of today. Sociobiological interpretations of ethnicity assume that there are tangible explanations for ethnicity. Some of the followers of these schools are convinced that generic linkages by itself are responsible for accentuating ethnic ties. Another group within the same school thinks that biological and kinship ties evolved and are furthered by cultural influences. The explanations offered by various scholars suggest that this school of thought, though is primarily rooted in evolutionary construction of human societies. Shaw and Wong argue that recognition of group affiliation is genetically encoded, being a product of early human evolution, even when the ability to recognize the members of one's family group was necessary for survival. Box 22.2 Concept of Ethnos. There are frequent references and endorsement of a primordialist position in Russian and Soviet anthropology. The concept of ethnos is in the works of Russian scholars that was later developed by Y.U. Bromley in 1974, among other, defines it as ethnos as a group of people speaking one and the same language and admitting common origin, characterized by a set of customs and a lifestyle which are preserved and sanctified by tradition, which distinguishes it from others of the same kind. The sociobiological interpretations of ethnicity were critical in developing a framework for the study of ethnogenesis. According to the theory of ethnogenesis, ethnos emerged as a consequence of joint effect of cosmic energies and landscape. The primordial model of studying ethnicity has perceived diverse reactions. Simple sociobiological explanations of ethnicity that interpret ethnic groups as only extended kin groups were severely critiqued by some scholars, but found support in the writings of scholars such as Clifford Geertz. Geertz argued that ties of blood, language, and culture are seen by actors to be ineffable and obligatory, that they are seen as natural. As members of society, most of you must have experienced these sentiments yourself. Important question in the understanding of ethnicity is how are these sentiments rationalized in the context of empirical situations demanding loyalties. Primordialists would argue that the kinship bonds and cultural attachments would always reign supreme and govern social and political actions. Geertz extends his argument when he writes, the crystallization of a direct conflict between primordial and civil sentiments, this longing not be belong to any other groups, gives to the problem variously called tribalism, parochialism, communalism, and so on, a more ominous and deeply threatened quality than most of the other, also very serious and intractable problem that new state face. It is this debate that dominates discussions in the constructions of modern day civil society, in which equality is considered as the only legitimate principle. Differences in terms of culture, language, religion, and origins are accepted and celebrated, but perpetualization of any of these primary attributes for establishing separate political identities within any existing nation state are viewed with disdain. Students of ethnicity are constantly engaged in debating whether the ethnicity is primordial or manipulated by individuals with political intents. 22.5 Instrumentalist Approach. Students of ethnicity are constantly asking, is ethnicity an aspect of human nature, or is it to whatsoever extent defined situationally, strategically, or tactically manipulable and capable of change at both the individual and collective levels? Is it only socially constructed? We have already reflected upon the first questions and made you familiar with different positions that scholars take on ethnicity being an integral part of human nature. We will now discuss the second questions, also discuss an instrumentalist approach to ethnicity. The instrumentalist approach became popular in sociological and political science writing in late 60s and early 70s. Name of Frederick Barth and Paul Brass are commonly associated with popularizing instrumentalist positions in social science literature. Also sometimes referred to as situationalist perspective, it emphasizes plasticity in maintaining ethnic group boundaries. It argues that the people can change membership and move from one ethnic group to another. The change can take place either because of circumstances or, as a Paul Brass say, because manipulation by political elites. He regard ethnicity as a product of political myths created and manipulated by cultural elites in their pursuit of advantages and power. The cultural forms, values, and practices of ethnic groups becomes resources for elites in competition for political power and economic advantage. They become symbols and reference for the identification of members of group, which are called up in order to ease the creation of political identity. In his two books, Language, Religion and Politics in North India, Ethnicity and Nationalism, Theory and Comparison, Brass closely examine issues of ethnicity and nationalism in the context of India. Brass borrowed De Vaux's definition of ethnicity that viewed ethnicity as consisting of subjective, symbolic and emblematic used by a group of people of any aspect of culture in order to differentiate themselves from other groups, and modified it, replacing the last phrase to suggest in order to create internal cohesion and differentiate themselves for other groups. In this explanation, Brass is asserting that the importance of symbols and the need for internal cohesion for ethnicity to flourish. When we examine these assertions in empirical context, we can understand why political parties constantly keep inventing and reinventing symbols attached to different groups for commanding loyalty and in situations of political realignment. Cow slaughter, Muslim personal law, and dwindling importance of Urdu language are some of symbolic issues that are frequently raised in political debates. Frederick Barth, on the other hand, was always convinced that the focus for the investigation of ethnicity should be the ethnic boundary that defines the group, adapting the definition that ethnicity is social organization of cultural differences. Barth, in his symposium Ethnic Groups and Boundaries, 1969, regarded ascription and self-ascription as critical to the process of establishing group boundaries. Box 22.3, Corporate Model of Ethnic Group. An ethnic group has biologically self-perpetuating members of this group shared basic cultural values, and these values manifest itself in overt cultural forms. Third, the group was a bounded social field of communications and interaction. And fourth, its members identified themselves and were identified by others as belonging to that group. Barth, in his critique of the corporate model, argued that this elucidation of ethnic groups assumed that various groups in the society lived in relative isolation as an island in itself. In his interpretation, ethnic groups as ontological collectives are malleable. He argued that the ethnic identity and its production of and reproduction in social interaction is to be treated as problematic features of social reality. He recommended that the ethnographer must examine the practices and process whereby ethnicity and ethnic boundaries are socially constructed and perpetuated. To arrive at this understanding, Barth asserted that this construction is possible only when we acknowledge that ethnic groups are categories of ascription and identification by the actors themselves. Barth's model of ethnic highlights in the following features. Analysis of ethnicity begins by understanding the situations held by social actors. Example, actors are being asked to ascertain their identity in a situation of confrontations and cooperation. The shades that ethnicity identity acquires will be essentially determined by this perception. Second, the focus of attentions then becomes the maintenance of ethnic boundaries. If it is a situation of confrontation, ethnicity attains center stage. It expresses itself in a far more assertive terms than it would be either in a natural situation, in neutral situations, or underplay differences in a situation asking for economic or political cooperation. The structured interactions between us and them across boundaries define the strategic situation. Reflection and Action 22.1 outline the features of Barth's model of ethnicity. The second, we finished the third and the most critical of this criteria are notions of ascriptions, both the members of the ethnic group in the question and those outside the group. Ethnicity acquires political impetus primarily because of this criterion of ascription in situations where an individual assumes himself to be a member but it is not so perceived by others. His own sense of belongingness carries little or no weight at all. Fourth, ethnicity is not fixed, it is situationally defined. Most interesting example of this is observed in situations of transmigrations, wherein individuals may ascribe themselves to different ethnic groups or attach different degree of importance to their sense of belonging. In other words, either overplay or underplay ethnicity situationally. Fifth, ecological issues are particularly influential in determining ethnic identity. If economic niches are constructive and resource limited, it is invariably seen that in such situations ethnicity becomes much more pronounced. Commenting on Barth's understanding of ethnicity, Jenkins writes, Barth emphasizes that ethnic identity is generated, confirmed and transformed in the course of interactions and transaction between decision-making strategic individuals. Ethnicity in ethnic group and boundaries is perhaps before it is anything else a matter of politics, decision-making and goal orientation. Shared culture is, in this model, best understood as generated in and by process of ethnic boundary maintenance rather than the other way around. The production and reproduction of differences vice external others is what creates the image of similarity internally vice each other. Sociologists and social anthropologists have argued that this model of ethnicity is essentially borrowed from the works of Max Weber. Barth facilitated its understanding by differentiating it from notions of race and culture. According to Vermeulen and Grovers, Barth presented ethnicity or ethnic identity as an aspect of social organization, not of culture. Wallman further Barth's understanding and argues that ethnicity is the process by which their differences is used to enhance the senses of us for purpose of organizations or identification, because it takes two. Ethnicity can only happen at the boundary of us in confrontations of by contrast with them, and as the sense of us changes, so the boundary between us and them shifts. Not only does the boundary shift, but the criteria which mark it changes. This explanation makes it clear that ethnicity is transactional. It is essentially impermanent and in that sense has nothing to do with biological inheritance. It is these features that distinguishes instrumentalist approach from primordialist perceptions and ethnicity. Ethnic identity is shifting. It is always two-sided. Our being Hindus or Muslims, Gujarati or Telugu is immaterial unless these identities are locked in vice versa situations. The key issues in these interactions is manipulation of perceived significant differences in their generation. Abner Cohen, 1974, while analyzing Barth's contribution, have differences with his perception of ethnicity. Handelman believes that the cultural content of ethnicity is an important aspect of its social organization. A crude dichotomy between the cultural and social is misleading. To this he adds that ethnicity is socially organized or incorporated in differing degrees of groupness, on which depends its salience and importance of individual experience. Moving from the casual to corporate, Handelman distinguishes the ethnic set, ethnic category, the ethnic network, the ethnic associations, and the ethnic community. Ethnic identities can, for example, organize everyday life without ethnic groups featuring locally as significant social forms. 22.6 Constructivist model of ethnicity. The constructivist of ethnicity is located in the interpretative paradigm based on postmodernism. In this interpretation, emphasis has shifted to negotiation of multiple subjects over group boundaries and identity. Sokolowski and Tishkov stress that in this atmosphere of renewed sensitivity to the dialectics of the objective and the subjective, in the process of ethnicity, identify, formation, and maintenance. Even the negotiable ethnic character of ethnic boundaries stressed by Barth has two remnants of his objectivist predecessors' tendency to reification. It was argued that terms like group, boundary still cannot fix the identity, and Barth's concerns with maintenance tends to relay it still more. The mercurial nature of ethnicity was accounted for when it was identified as a set of socio-cultural critics: physical appearance, name, language, history, religion, nationality, which defines a shared identity for members and non-members, a series of nesting dichotomizations of inclusiveness and exclusiveness. 22.7 Jenkin's model of ethnicity. Jenkin has offered a basic socio-anthropological model of ethnicity which is equally relevant for sociological understanding. The model is summarized as follows. Ethnicity is about cultural differentiation, although to reiterate the main theme of social identity. Identity is always a dialectic between similarity and difference. Ethnicity is centrally concerned with the culture shared meaning, but it is also rooted in and also to a considerable extent to the outcome of social interaction. Ethnicity is no more fixed or unchanging than the culture of which it is a component of, or in the situation in which it is produced and reproduced. Ethnicity as a social identity is a collective and individual, externalized in social interactions and internalized in personal identification. Jenkins cautions against our tendency to reify culture and ethnicity. It is essential to us to remember that ethnicity or culture is not something that people have or they belong to, but it is a complex repertories which people experiences, use, learn to and do in their daily lives, within which they construct ongoing sense of themselves and an understanding of their fellows. Jenkin is representative modern school of thinkers on ethnicity who assume constructivist position. The fundamental of the concept and defined above emphasis social construction and everyday practice, acknowledging change as well as stability and allowing us to recognize individuality in experience and agency as well as stability, and allowing us to recognize individuality in experience and agency as well as the sharing of culture and collective identification. This reconstruction of ethnicity holds the view that ethnicity is neither inherited nor completely manipulable, positions that were assumed by Instrumentalist and Primordialist respectively. Box 22.2 22.4 The Plasticity of Ethnicity. There are limits to the plasticity of ethnicity as well as to its fixity and solidity. Is the founding premise of the development of an understanding of ethnicity, which permit us to appreciate that although it is imagined, it is not imaginary, to acknowledge its antiquity as well as its modernity. Rethinking demands that we should strike a balanced view of ethnicity, of ethnic attachments, somewhere between irresistible emotion and utter cynicism. Neither blindly primordial nor completely manipulable. Ethnicity and its allotropes are principles of collective identification and social organization in terms of culture and history, similarly and difference that show little signs of withering away. In itself, this is neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It is probably just very human. It is hard to imagine the social world in their absence. 22.8 Race and Ethnicity. Relationship between race and ethnicity is complex. Genesis of the terms race are traced to Latin word generatio and ratio, enatio and radix, to Spanish and Castilian raza, Italian raza and Old French haras, which such diverse meaning as generation, root, nobility of blood, patch of threadbare, diverse meaning as generation, root, nobility of blood, patch of threadbare or defective cloth, taint or contamination or horse breeding. The term race has been in popular use much before ethnicity was adapted in popular and academic vocabulary. Race came into scientific and academic parlance as a classificatory feature. Physical anthropologists used physical features to classify what some may describe as human types. However, man's luster to conquer his fellow beings and subordinate them resulted in tremendous abuse of these so-called classificatory studies that were prompted to facilitate scientific research. Magnus Hirschfeld in 1938 described racial abuse as racism. The genocide that was unleashed in World War II in the name of protection of purity of races made an academician and politician equally shy of using it in public domain. The concept of ethnic group introduced in the mid-50s was an acknowledged attempt to provide a neutral system of classifying human groups on the basis of cultural differences rather than distinguishing them on the basis of racial characteristic. It was argued that the terminology of ethnic group could provide a value-neutral construct and avoid prejudiced and stereotypical categorization of people in hierarchical and discriminatory categories. Many scholars believed in the usefulness of this distinction, but others thought there was hardly any merit in this distinction, as race is only one of the markers through which ethnic differences are validated and ethnic boundary marker established. Those authors supporting the expediency of making this distinction would argue that while ethnic social relations are not necessarily hierarchical or conflictual, race relations would certainly appear to be. Reflections and Actions 22.2 discuss the relationship between race and ethnicity and bring out the points of comparison. One may reason that even when race is often constructed and conceived in terms of physical and phenotypal typical differences, prejudices and stereotypes accompanying these perceptions are socially articulated and perceived. In this sense, many would argue that the race is a allotrope or of ethnicity. Jenkins prefers to argue the other by suggesting that ethnicity and race are different kinds of concept. They do not actually constitute a true pair. The most that can be said is that at certain times and in certain places, culturally specific conception of race or more correctly of racial differentiation have featured, sometimes very powerfully in the repertoire of ethnic boundary maintaining devices. Benton has argued that primary differences between race and ethnic group is that membership is in an ethnic group is voluntary, whereas membership in the racial group is not. And this would imply that ethnic group is all about inclusion, whereas race is all about exclusion. We are once again returning to the basic categories of us versus them, critical to our understanding of ethnicity as well as race. But as perceived by Jenkins, would argue ethnicity is about group identification, whereas race is about social categorization. Michael Omi and Howard Winand in their book Racial Formation in the United States in 1986 take the position that opting a maximum incorporating race within the border confines on ethnic group will encourage the strategy of blaming the victim. Solo's summing up of these differing positions make perceptive reading. Omi and Winand argue, partly on political grounds, that any true sociological concept could also conceivably be put to bad political ends. It is also necessary to believe that scholars who see a family relationship between race and ethnicity are therefore guided by an assimilation its bias. Omi and Winand's last point, however, is well taken. Gordon's maxim that all races are ethnic groups could be misunderstood as inviting a method of regarding all blacks as only one ethnic groups, because they are also race. Races may be and often are ethnically differentiated. African American, Jamaicans in the United States. Just as ethnic group may be racially differentiated, Hispanics who may be or of any race. Omi and Winden's argument supports the need for a careful examination of the relationship of visible and cultural modes of groups construction in specific cases, but not the assumption that there is an absolute dualism between race and ethnicity and deep rift between them. 22.9 Conclusion. Pierre Van de Berge is the one who offers systematic interpretation of differences between race and ethnicity. Berge's much acclaimed work, Race and Racism, written in 1996, suggests that four principal connotations of race, making it confusing. At the outset, he rejects physical anthropological construction of 3 or 4 races, arguing that this outdated connotation is no longer tenable. The second connotation of race that he prefers to be used in terms of ethnic group is when we speak of the French race or the Jewish race, etc., etc. The third explanation argues race to be a synonym of species. It is only the fourth construction offered by Berge that he recommends we should use. According to this view, a race refers to human groups that defines itself and or is defined by other groups as different from other groups by virtue of innate and immutable physical characteristics. It is important for the students to note here that sociological conceptions of race takes specific note of visible and physical as suggested by Gordon, as described by Berge, that of innate and immutable distinctions from those described as cultural. The most discerning contribution made by these scholars is that distinctions, whether racial or ethnic, are a matter of both physical and verbal perceptions. Qualifying this insight, Berge reasons. In practice, the distinction between a racial and ethnic group is sometimes blurred by several facts. Cultural traits are often regarded as genetic and inherited. Example, body color, which is a function of diet, cosmetic and other cultural items. Physical appearance can be culturally changed by scarification, surgery and cosmetics, and the sensory perceptions of physical differences is affected by cultural perception of race. That is, rich negro may be seen as lighter than an equally dark poor negro, as suggested by the Brazilian proverb money bleaches. However, distinction between race and ethnicity remain analytically useful. The rhetoric of making distinctions on the basis of cultural content or descent overlooks the fact that matters relating to descent accentuate cultural crux on which cultural differences are constructed and boundaries defined on or defined. So some of this admirably saying it is a matter of a tendency, not of absolute distinction. Mary Walter, in her distinguished work Ethnic Opinions, chronicled it as follows: certain ancestors take precedence over others in the societal rules on descent and ancestry recording. If one believes one is part of English and part German and identifies as German, one is not in danger of being accused of trying to pass as non-English and of being redefined English. But if one were part African and a part German, one's self-identification as German would be highly suspect and probably not accepted if one looked black according to the prevailing social norms. Without taking either of position, it is important for us to understand that while constructing ethnicity, identification based either on physical features or cultural similarities becomes the key factor. It is this construction of identity and the sociological process of how processes of identification operate as markers of establishing boundaries that will be discussed in the following lessons. So 22.10 is various reference books like Connecting the Race and Ethnic Phenomena, Sociology, Anthropological Constructions of Ethnicity, an Introduction Guide, Race Relations, Ethnic Groups and Boundaries, the Social Organization of Cultural Difference, Thinking Sociologically, Ethnicity and Social Change, Ethnicity Theory and Experience, ethnic phenomenon, language, religion and politics in North India, Soviet ethnology and anthropology today, ethnicity and nationalism, theory and comparison, two-dimensional man, an essay on power and symbolism in complex society, ethnicity, problems and focus in anthropology, the interpretation of cultures, dynamics of ethnic identification, and beyond the melting pot, and ethnicity, theory and experience, then American all, ethnicity, ideology and American identity in the era of World War II, and the uprooted, the epic story of the great migrations that made the American people, racism, then rethinking ethnicity, insiders and outsiders in the American journal writer, okay, then racial formation in the United States, peasants and dance, the Danish national identity and political culture, then genetic seeds of warfare, theories of ethnicity, a classical reader, theory of American ethnicity, the social science encyclopedia, the anthropology of ethnicity, beyond ethnic groups and boundaries, ethnicity and the boundary processing context, theories of race and ethnic relations, ethnic opinions choosing identities in America, economy and society, an outline of interpretative sociology, 3 volumes. These are the references given in this unit. So this is the end of the unit 22, Conceptualizing Ethnicity.